Well, good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here with you all this morning. Very encouraged to be around you, around other Christians who desire to worship God. And I pray that everything we do this morning will be good and pleasing to Him. This morning, our lesson will come from Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 17. Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 17. So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified with him. We're in the middle of a series of lessons where we're going through Romans 8, kind of dividing this up into certain sections. And last week we looked at verses 1 through 11. And in particular, our series is based on verse 6 of Romans chapter 8, where Paul writes, "For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." And so throughout this series, we're looking at what it means to set our minds on the Spirit and how this cultivates life and peace. As far as I'm concerned, verse 6 is a promise to all of us that if we set our minds on the Spirit, life and peace will inevitably follow. And I think this can be seen when we consider the mere fact that what we think about affects our behavior. What we dwell on and what we contemplate affects us, and it changes us. And so if we dwell on and contemplate money, for example, that affects our behavior. It affects how we act, how we live, often results in things like being unsatisfied perpetually. Just no one can be satisfied as long as they are dwelling on money. And this works for all kinds of things like money and power and sex. Just anytime we dwell on these things, our lives inevitably follow. And the same is true about the Spirit. To set the mind on the Spirit means that life and peace inevitably follows. And so what we've been going over is what this means, because I don't think it's always clear what it means to set the mind on the Spirit. Because Paul had an understanding of the Spirit that was more than just the Holy Spirit, right? I don't just sit and think of the words the Holy Spirit over and over. There's something more to it than that. For example, when Paul contrasts the flesh and the Spirit in Galatians, when Paul writes about the fruit of the Spirit, he has specific things in mind, right? One of them being peace, which is exactly what we're looking at. Things like love and joy. Those are things that specifically pertain to the Spirit. And so we've been going through section by section asking, what is something we can set our minds to so that life and peace can inevitably follow? And last week we looked at the freedom we have in the Spirit. That's something we can set our minds to and we can think about, that we are free in the Spirit. We are free to live in a certain way. We are free from sin, in a sense. And this week, what we're going to set our minds to is that we are led by the Spirit. The Spirit leads us. In fact, when we look at verses 12 through 17, the heart of this passage is verse 14, that for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. So everything, verses 12 and 13, and then verses 15 through 17, all kind of branch out of this idea that we are led by the Spirit. And to be led by the Spirit means that we are sons and daughters of God. And so what I'd like to do is to examine kind of what this means. What does it mean to be led by the Spirit, and how does this affect us? So first, let's look at the passage and then think about what it means to be led, because it's important to point out that for Paul, in this passage here, he's talking about it in terms of a parent-child relationship. So when we think about being led, we have to think about it in those terms. A parent-child relationship. So Paul says in verse 14, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. And he goes on in verse 15, you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. And he goes on to say we are heirs of God because we are children. And so you have this parent-child relationship. And so when we think about what it means to be led by God, we have to think about it in those terms, because that's what Paul is referring to. And I want to just take a moment and think about, what does it mean to be led? Well, it means, first of all, we're not in charge. Because if you're being led, you're not in charge. And that is an important point to grasp, that when we are led by the Spirit, we're not in charge. God is in charge. The Spirit is in charge. And it also means not only are we not in charge, but we have to trust where God is leading us. Because if we don't trust where God is leading us, we won't be led by God very well. It's very hard to follow a leader when you don't trust the leader. And now we've got to say, okay, maybe we do trust God. But now we have to take it a step further, because Paul talks about this in the context of verse 17, which is suffering. And when we think about what it means to be led by God, we have to think about it also in those terms. That God sometimes leads us into very difficult places and still asks us to trust him. In fact, if you think about Jesus being led by the Spirit, right? The first time we read about it in those explicit terms. He was led by the Spirit. What do we read about him? He was driven into the wilderness to be tempted. And we as Christians, we follow this example. And so we must trust where God is leading us, because when we are led by God, we are often led into very difficult situations. And so we've got to trust our leader to an extent. So when we think about what it means to be led, it means we're not in charge, and it means we've got to trust where we are being led. And if we trust God even in suffering, then we begin to see the world very differently. In fact, we begin to see the world as first century Christians saw the world, which is they saw it as a safe place. And that sounds odd, because many of these Christians were, as you may know, highly persecuted, fed to lions, and yet they saw the world as a safe place to live in. Not because no harm would come to them, but something much deeper than that, which is God wouldn't leave them even when harm comes upon them. That their salvation was secure and death was actually gain, as Paul writes. And so when we talk about what it means to be led, we have to think about this as Paul would have understood it. But now I want us to really understand this, as I said, in a parent-child relationship. Because when parents lead children, being led is not a passive thing. Right? When parents guide children and lead children, the children aren't mindless. The goal is to guide them and engage them. And the children have an important part to play, a very active role to play. And so Paul is describing this in terms of a parent-child relationship, which means that the one being led is not passive. That we're actually being led in a very active sense, because this is a parent-child relationship. That's the analogy that's being used. And so we are people who are led by the Spirit. Because if we're not led by the Spirit, we're going to be led by the world. Because when you examine the New Testament writers, you see there really only are two options. You're either led by God or you're led by the world. You're led by Satan. There is no other option. Everyone is led by something. And this is an important point that really struck me as I was putting this lesson together, is how much the world tries to claim us and tries to say that we belong to it and we are its children and we must do the things it tells us to. In fact, you look at what Paul says here in chapter 8 and verse 12. Paul writes, "So then, brothers, we are debtors." He doesn't say we're not. He says we are. We are debtors, but not to the flesh. But this means that sometimes the world and this domain of the flesh actually does consider us its debtors. And I think that's actually a very good way of thinking of the way the world relates to people and how much it abuses people and how much it misuses people. Is it looks at people as if they are debtors to the world, as if they owe it something. And Paul doesn't deny that we're debtors. We are. He says we are debtors, but we are not debtors to the flesh. The world will try to claim us. It will try to tell us how to live, as if we belong to it, as if we are to be led by it. And it's important for us to realize that we are not led by the world. We don't have to live the way it tells us to. That's what we looked at last week. We have the freedom not to do the things it tells us we have to do. We don't have to live according to these arbitrary standards that the world sets up for people, as if we always have to be paying attention, to politics and what's going on. We're not debtors to the world. We don't have to do those things. We're not required. We have the freedom in Christ to say, I would rather live my life and not pay attention to the gross things you do. Thank you very much. We have the freedom to do that. And it's important to understand that we are either led by the world or we are led by the Spirit, and there is no other option. And the world will consider us its debtors, and it will claim us as its own. And the way the world leads, Paul actually tells us here in this passage, in verse 15, the world leads through fear. And if you don't understand this, then, the current events just won't make any sense. Verse 15, Paul writes, "For you did not receive the spirit of slavery," that is the spirit that comes from the world, "to fall back into fear. But you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." Notice he says to fall back into fear, because that's what it is to come out of the world. It's to be led by fear. And that is the way the world leads us. The world convinces us to be afraid of pain. The world convinces us to be afraid of suffering. And it says, I have the answers, and if you do these things I'm telling you to do, then you won't have pain and you won't have suffering. But the Christian perspective is, well, I'm safe even in pain and suffering. I have nothing to fear. The relationship between people in the world is very much like an abusive relationship. They lead through fear. They try to get us to be afraid of things and to act out of this fear. The world tries to convince us to be afraid of pain and suffering. It tries to convince us to be afraid of not getting what we want. There are a lot of people right now who are very afraid that they won't get what they want. That's an awful thing to be afraid of. Because when you're afraid of something like that, you actually end up never getting what you want, and you only live in fear. You see, the world claims us as its own, as debtors to it, and it leads through fear by getting us to be afraid of things we ought not to be afraid of. This is why setting our minds on the flesh can never be life and peace, right? That's our passage, is verse 6. That to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. You can never have life and peace if you don't set your mind on the Spirit, because the world leads through fear. You can't have this. And so we are either led by the world or we are led by the Spirit. And whoever leads us, we are children of the one who leads us. And this is why you have this, so that those, in verse 14, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. If we're led by God, we are actually children of God. And we gain all the benefits that come from this position and this status. We're counted as heirs, Paul says in verse 17. If we are children, then we are heirs. We gain the inheritance that belongs to Christ, but Christ has graciously given to us. And in fact, this is so guaranteed that the Spirit bears witness with our spirit. You have this passage in verse 16. I had to take time to think about this and what this means. Verse 16, Paul writes, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. Why is that important in this passage? I had to take a moment and really think about this. Why is it important that the Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God? And I think the answer is because this has to do with being assured of our salvation and of the promises. This gets back to, if you remember when Jesus makes his claims, they say to him, you can't bear witness about yourself. Do you remember that? They say to Jesus, you can't bear witness about yourself. Your witness and your testimony is no good because you're the only one making the claim. And I think what Paul is doing here is he's saying, right from this Jewish perspective, you've got two witnesses, your spirit and the Spirit. Therefore, your claims are legally binding. This claim to an inheritance is legally binding because you have two witnesses. Your spirit and the other spirit is the ultimate witness, right? The Spirit of God bears witness with our spirit. Because sometimes when we do things, doesn't it often feel like no one saw it and maybe God didn't see it? And will I ever even get credit for it? And Paul, I think, is really trying to assure us, yes, because you're not the only one who bears witness to this, the Spirit also bears witness to this. You have a legally binding, legally applicable two witnesses. It's not just you alone, but the Spirit himself bears witness that you are a child of God, and no one can take that from you. And because we are led by the Spirit, we are children of God. That's exactly what Paul says in verse 14, that all who are led by the Spirit are sons of God, because we are children of whatever it is that leads us. And if we're not led by the Spirit, then we're being led by the world. As I said, there are only really two options. And if we're being led by the world, then we are children of the world. And this is an important point, not just in Paul, but Jesus himself makes this point. So hold your finger here in Romans 8. And if you look, for example, in John chapter 8, in John chapter 8, verses 42 through 47. John 8, 42 through 47. Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He is a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is the liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell you the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God." You see that for Jesus, it was very important for us to think about who our Father is. And so he's speaking to these Jews and telling them, you can't even understand what I'm saying because you're of your father, the devil. And so when we skip back to Romans chapter 8, and you have this verse 14, that all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God, you begin to see that for especially these early Christians who came out of Judaism, it was important for them to ask this question, who is my father? And what am I a child of? And for those who are led by the Spirit, we are children of God. But for those who are led by the world, they are children of the world. And in fact, if you look back in Romans 8 in verse 15, Paul says that you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into the world. The greatest position a child of the world can attain is to be a slave. That's the highest position a child of the world can attain. Have you ever known someone, or maybe even in our own lives, in our past we were like this, who was just so focused on things like, as we talked about earlier, money and power and sex, who was so focused on it they couldn't even see that they were addicts in a sense, right? They were slaves to those passions. Because the highest position a child of the world can attain is a slave. And it's the worst kind of slavery because many people don't even know that they're slaves. I mean, if you actually think about this in terms of drug addiction, this is why we have to have interventions, right? Because people don't realize they are slaves. They don't realize they're addicts. It's like it's suddenly come upon us, and we're fooled into thinking that I'm okay even when I'm not, and I have a handle on things even when I don't. But that's a very obvious example, and I'm trying to use an obvious example to say this applies to any kind of person who just pursues the world. They're slaves of the world, and it's the worst kind of slavery because they don't even know that they're slaves. And so the highest position that a person of the world can attain is to be a slave. But the highest position a child of God can attain is to be an heir. Right? The slave does nothing but give everything and get nothing in return. The heir does nothing and receives everything. And that's who we are as children of God. And this is, as I said, in Paul's sense, it's legally binding, right? The Spirit bears witness with our spirit. You have these two witnesses who are bearing witness to this legal act of inheritance. And so it's true. It's legally applicable and binding. Now, it's obvious, I think, to tell who we're being led by when we look at how we act and how we behave. Because this is something I've said a few times now, and I'll try not to say it anymore after this, that you know what something is by its actions and by its operations. And so the example I've used a few times now is a tree. If you've never seen a tree being a tree, you would never know what a tree is. You've got to see it replenishing oxygen and bearing fruit and growing and, being cut down, used for wood and art and things like that. You've got to see it in its actions in order to know what it is. And the same is true about what we are children of and what we're being led by. It's very obvious to see someone who is being led by the world. It's very obvious also to see someone who's being led by the Spirit. Someone who is led by God and is actually a child of God. And because our actions reveal this, our own wills, therefore, become very important in all of this. And this is something I said last week, that the essence of slavery is the undermining of the will, or the undermining of volition. If you want to leave a house but you're chained to the wall, right, your will is being undermined. You're a slave. You're stuck there. If you want to rest because your body aches but you're being forced into labor, right, your will is being undermined and you're a slave. And so our wills become actually very important. And in fact, it is our will that separates the children of God from the children of the world. And what I mean is this, that the child of God can actually do the things they want to do. And this sounds odd at first. But you begin to see this, that Paul says in verse 13, if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. The child of God can actually do the things we desire to do. Now, sometimes we have bad desires, right? Or we don't know where our desires come from. But the child of God can have desires that are rightly oriented according to how God designed us and can actually do it. We can be people who say, I don't want to live in sin anymore. And God himself helps us do it. That's what Paul says, that if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body. You have this very cooperative act where God is helping us to put to death the deeds of the body. But the slave of the world, you remember in verse 15, Paul refers to this, the spirit of slavery that Christians are no longer a part of. Right? The slave of the world is a slave to sin. The slave of the world cannot do the things they want to do. Let's just use the same examples we've been using. If someone only thinks about money and all they want is money, do they ever have enough? No. In fact, it's this weird thing where even people who are very wealthy are kind of deceived into thinking, I don't have very much. And it's very odd. People who are very greedy for things like power or things like sex, they never have enough. They never attain their goal. And that's the point I'm trying to get across, that the child of God can actually attain the goals. The child of God can actually do the things they want to do. But the child of the world is a slave to sin. And the child of the world actually never gets really what they want. And even if they get it for a moment, they lose it all in eternity, and therefore they never get it, really. Because when you have an eternal perspective from a finite perspective, right, you spend far more of your time in the eternal perspective, and you really don't actually get the things you want. This is why being led by the Spirit is an active thing, because our wills are actually very important here. And understanding we can do the things we want to do. because God helps us to do them. And God also helps us to have rightly ordered desires, right? We don't just desire things like greed or money or power. We desire God. We desire to live well, to live meaningfully. And God assists us in this to actually and truly accomplish this. And this is why, as I said, being led by the Spirit is active, and it's not merely a passive thing. It's really our will engaged in and cooperating with the Spirit as we are being led by the Spirit the way a parent leads a child. And when a parent leads a child, the will of the child becomes very important. It's not a mindless activity. This means then that the process of being led by the Spirit is the process of transforming us from the inside out. In a way, it begins with setting our minds on the Spirit, as we look in verse 6. This is our main verse throughout this whole series. It begins with setting our minds on the Spirit and the things of the Spirit. And that this transitions into the Spirit helping us in putting sin to death, as we read in verse 13. That if you notice I'm going to read out of the ESV. Notice the language that Paul uses in this kind of cooperative act. That if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. It's very cooperative in language. And being led by the Spirit is this process of transforming us from the inside out, beginning with setting our minds on the Spirit, leading into this transformation of the will, which results ultimately in our being called the children of God, until ultimately we look at verse 17, where Paul says that, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. So you have this process of transformation from the inside out, beginning with what we set our minds to, ending in the ultimate glorification of the entire person. And it's not cut and dry where it just starts here and then nothing happens until the ultimate glorification. It's this process of being transformed from the inside out. This is why Paul elsewhere writes, that we are transformed and renewed in our minds, because it begins there in setting our minds on the Spirit until we are ultimately transformed at the return of Christ. And so I want us to consider this as something that we set our minds to. We set our mind on being led by the Spirit. This means understanding that God is in charge. And it's important for us to set our minds on this. To remember, I'm being led somewhere. I'm not blindly going somewhere. This also means trusting where God is leading us. Because being led by the Spirit sometimes means being led into suffering. In fact, Scripture virtually guarantees it, that we will be led into difficulty. But we trust God because God has demonstrated to us that even suffering is a safe place to be. And this goes back to how we think about life and peace. If to set our minds on the Spirit is life and peace, but setting our minds on the Spirit also means being led into suffering, then maybe we have to rethink what it means to have life and peace as actually something that can and maybe necessarily includes suffering for us. That's really the question. If our peace can be taken from us at suffering, how strong was our peace to begin with? And I think that's what early Christians really understood, that life in peace is something that includes suffering, because even in suffering, we are safe because God is with us. When we set our minds on being led by the Spirit, this means understanding that God is in charge, really setting our minds to this. This means that we trust where God is leading us and really setting our minds to trusting where God is taking us. But this also means that being led is not passive. Just as a parent leading a child doesn't mean the child does nothing. It's a very active and interactive relationship. Because that's what we have with God, is a very real and interactive relationship. And so Paul promises us that if we set our minds on the Spirit, life and peace will follow. And last week we looked at setting our minds on the freedom we have in the Spirit. And this week we're looking at setting our minds to being led by the Spirit, that God is leading us. And if we set our minds on these things, then life and peace will inevitably follow even in our own lives. At this time, we always like to offer an invitation. If there's anything we can do for you to help you in understanding what it means to be led by God, and where God sometimes leads people, please talk to us. Please don't keep it to yourself. Talk to us, talk to someone else maybe you're comfortable with, but please talk to someone. If you have questions, if you need prayers, if you need assistance in any way, please talk to us or even make your need known now as we'll stand and sing the song of invitation.